Welcome to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. In this podcast, we break down high-profile celebrity estate planning cases for advisors and their clients. Most celebrity estate catastrophes are based on the same issues that everyday people face, just with the volume turned up. Our goal is to identify and extract the individual estate planning issues that lie at the heart of each story. We then discuss what advisors should expect and how to avoid common pitfalls. Hosted by wealthmanagement.com senior editor David Lenok.
Every estate tells a story. Some define a legacy, while others highlight lessons learned the hard way. To avoid costly planning pitfall, trust companies, banks, and wealth management firms rely on the full suite of modern solutions from SS&C Black Diamond Trust Services. Whether optimizing for tax efficiency, managing complex assets, or securing intergenerational wealth, Black Diamond helps you bring clarity and control to the most complicated estates. Learn more at www.sscblackdiamond.com. SS&C Black Diamond, powering the future of trust and estate management. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of wealthmanagement.com's Celebrity Estates, Wills of the Rich and Famous. For anyone new to the podcast, in each installment, myself and a guest take on a different celebrity estate and attempt to extract some key lessons that planners can apply to their more traditional clients. The idea being that celebrity estate planning stories, although often ridiculous in their details, generally have at their cores very basic issues that can just as easily apply to non-famous or fabulously wealthy clients. To learn more about estate planning and how you can better serve your clients, visit wealthmanagement.com/trusts-estates. Our monthly journal features tax law updates, wealth planning, retirement planning, and much more, written by thought leaders in the industry. That's wealthmanagement.com/trusts-estates. Our guest this week is Ian Freeman. Ian is a Northwestern mutual wealth management advisor and founder of the Freeman Group in Boca Raton. His practice focuses on helping families and business owners secure strong futures through insurance and risk management solutions. He works with ultra-wealthy families on estate and legacy planning, with a particular focus on the human dynamics behind the plan, unspoken family expectations, identity shifts after liquidity events, and the emotional pressure tied to wealth transfer. Ian is also the author of the forthcoming memoir, Life Beneath the Suit, Madness, Mayhem, and the Meaning I Found in the Mess. Thanks for joining us, Ian.
Pleasure's mine. It's an honor. Thank you.
Now, the subject of today's episode is legendary boxer and, I guess, grill salesman George Foreman. Big George was a two-time world heavyweight champion and Olympic gold medalist. He is also, of course, the namesake of the George Foreman grill. His career had several acts, beginning with his shocking victory over Joe Frazier to win the heavyweight title in 1973. He would defend it twice before losing to Ali in the famous Rumble in the Jungle in Zaire in 1974. His career kind of hit the skids thereafter, and he retired from the sport in 1977. 2 decades later, Foreman, now an ordained minister, announced he would be making a comeback. Considered a joke by most. He shocked the world by beating Michael Moorer in 1995 to become the oldest heavyweight champion in history at age 46. And then he retired for good this time at age 48 with a record of 75-5. However, his most lucrative act was still yet to come. During his comeback, he often attributed his success to healthy eating. There's not enough scare quotes in the world for that one. An obviously tongue-in-cheek remark given his generally rotund stature at that stage in his life. He was approached by Salton Inc., which was looking for a spokesperson for its fat-reducing grill. And as of 2009, the George Foreman grill sold over 100 million units. George never really confirmed how much he earned exactly from the endorsement, but it's known that in 1999, Salton paid him $138 million for the right to use his name. And prior to that, he was making about 40% of the profits on each grill sold, which maths out to about $5 million a month at its peak. So he made about $200 million just from that endorsement in his lifetime. He sadly passed at natural causes at the age of 76 in Houston, leaving behind a $300 million estate to be split between his fifth wife and a total of 12 children, 7 girls and 5 boys, all of whom are famously named George Edward Foreman. When asked why he did this, Big George answered, "I named all my sons George Edward Foreman, so they would always have something in common. I say to them, if one of us goes up, then we all go up together. And if one goes down, we all go down together. Now, legacy is one of those words that gets thrown around quite a bit in the financial advice industry, particularly as we move more and more towards more holistic models of serving clients. But the reality is it means very different things to very different people. So, some would consider George Foreman's legacy his marvelous boxing career or his wildly successful stint hawking grills. But it's also clear that the very name George Edward Foreman is an important part of that legacy as well. Important enough to Salt and Ink to shell out $138 million for the privilege of using it, and important enough to the man himself to bestow it on every one of his male progeny, along with all the pressure and expectations that comes with it. Ian, what are some of the more familial-focused aspects of legacy and legacy planning that are often overlooked but advisors should be aware of?
Thanks again for having me. It's such an interesting thing because people are so different in what they've learned. And I think that's a big part of it, David, is that people kind of become what they've learned or are doing the things that were either done or not done for them. Mm-hmm. So much of what we deal with is this relationship side of things. And the things like the money become completely irrelevant. But in so many cases, for example, someone that may come from wealth, it's never been talked about to them. So they don't have an idea about how to talk to it to their kids or to anybody else. So I think the biggest part of this is to get people talking about just general things and also to have them understand that what they say today may not be what they say in the future, mm-hmm. and to have some thought process around that may change and how they may want to address it.
Yeah, I think that's one of those sort of things about legacy that a lot of people and advisors too sort of misunderstand, this idea that these are rules for our family. They're sort of
right.
Carved in stone. These are things that we do. And, that doesn't really work in practice. I mean, I know there's some families with a certain level of wealth, maybe they can pull it off. But for most, it's things are meant to change. Times change, and a plan and a legacy that's meant to last hundreds of years, hopefully, is just not, it's impossible for it to, be initially designed to anticipate every possible permutation of how life can go.
Yeah. And statistically, as we know, what most wealth doesn't make it past the third generation, mm-hmm. Because things don't get talked about. If things happen and people haven't thought about that siblings may fight or a lot of different things that could potentially happen along the way. And so when we try to talk to people about that, it is so much more of the emotional side. And, even ask a simple question like, what's your philosophy about estate planning? And sometimes you could just shut up after that and learn everything you need to know, because in a lot of cases, they'll talk for 20 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of the beauty of these estate planning conversations, for advisors. A lot of advisors are scared of the topic a little bit.
Yes.
And the beauty of it is that you don't really need to be terribly knowledgeable to sort of get the ball rolling. You can kind of just ask simple questions like you just mentioned. What are your thoughts on estate planning? Yeah. and people will show you, they'll tell you, and they'll start coming up with more questions on their own. Like you can kind of get out of the way a little bit at that point for a while.
It's interesting, David, because, I didn't grow up with anything. And so when you see people that have zeros with their names, to me, it was just another couple of zeros. It was the same mm-hmm. problems. It just happened to be more zeros. So when I first got into this, it wasn't really intimidating. It was just, okay, I'm going to talk to people just in a little different way. And what I found was the less talking I did, the better it worked. And one of my great examples was we saw this guy who was a CEO of an oil company, and he was third generation CEO. And we went in to see him and we sat down and said, look, no, your grandfather was CEO, your father was CEO. But what we'd like to know is, what's your journey been like through this company? And he literally talked for 40 minutes, and told us everything we needed to know about where we needed to take him. Mm-hmm. So it's just so fascinating just to let people see where their emotions will go, and they just kind of work on themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, advisors think that these conversations are scary because they are. And clients often think that they're scary too, and they likely haven't had them. So when you bring these things up, it's not a conversation they've had 10,000 times. So they're going to have often a lot to say. and they're not going to know what they're going to say before they say it.
Yeah.
So you sort of, it sort of lends itself, by virtue of it being a thing that we don't really talk about, that once you get someone talking about it, they kind of, they haven't had that conversation before. They might have a lot of thoughts they didn't know they had.
Yeah. And one of the questions we can ask and say, well, listen, this is not a judgment. This is how we just kind of want to ask this, but what are your personal values that are of the greatest importance to you at this time? We always say at this time, because at this time in your life, it may be different than what it is in the future. And they're not used to that question and not used to saying, what are your personal values? Because they're thinking you're there to talk about all their money.
Yeah.
And you're not.
Yeah, it's sort of, this is where the industry is headed, right? It used to be that, either be you an advisor or an insurance person. It was a lot of spreadsheets and a lot of, Monte Carlo simulations and all that fun stuff.
Yeah.
But more and more technology has sort of taken that role, and advisors, you being a specialist in that is not as valuable as it once was. You have to find some other way to add value for your clients.
Exactly.
And part of that is maybe being their psychologist a little bit.
Well, it's not part of it. It's a lot of it. But I think what you said, David, is so important, because the way we try to discuss it is AI and all the things like that, the spreadsheets and everything you just brought up, which is 100% correct. That's the science. Where we come in is we hope we're the art.
Mm-hmm.
And the art is what ultimately gets people to take that action for themselves and their family, because you've gotten to the points and things that were bigger than any of the money.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the key. And that art part of it is what unfortunately has become a little bit missing. And we're still trying to do that as best we can.
Yeah, I really like this idea that you bring up of it being the art, right? Because that's kind of the definition of art. People, you look at something and like, oh, is that art? Is that not art? It's like, well, I don't know. Does it make you feel something?
Right.
It's like, yes or no. It's the easiest test, right? So I think in the same way, the art of financial advice is sort of bringing up these topics where it's like, all right, does talking about this make you feel something? What are these things in your life other than your money that make you feel something? And let's plan around those.
Yes. And it's so interesting because there's sometimes very simple things like saying, so how do you feel about paying estate taxes, just as a particular question? And, most people don't answer that. They automatically assume they don't want to pay them, and most don't. But every once in a while, you'll get the answer saying, I don't care. Whatever happens, happens.
Honestly, you're the second guest I've had on that I said that's talking to clients, and they've just been like, estate tax. Like a previous guest said that they had clients who were actually like in favor of paying it because they're just like, let the government have it. I got my use out of it.
Well, that's where we could have some real fun here. And I always say to them, and we're not on camera, but I want you to just picture me holding out my hand for a minute saying, look, ultimately at the end of the day, there's three places you can leave your money. It's not a debate. And I hold up my thumb, and it's, you could leave it to your family, kids, grandkids, great-grandkids, nephews, nieces, whatever it happens to be. The family is one. Then I hold up my index finger and I say, we could leave it to charity. And many people actually become more charitable as they get older. And that becomes very important to their legacy and other things that they're trying to do. And then I put up my middle finger and I go, the third place is the government. Notice which fingers I used. Okay. And what I say is, I'm not going to put down the other two fingers, but what we're trying to do is help understand how you feel about that one finger.
Yeah.
Amongst other things. And if that's not part of what you care about, great. Let's move on to the other things that are of greater importance to you.
So, I think, we're talking about legacy and we're kind of talking about money a little bit, but, we're passing on more than just the money. And as you mentioned, I think it's easy for clients when they start thinking, especially if they're first generation wealth creators, it's easier for them to start thinking that like the legacy starts with them, when in reality they've been part of a legacy, whether they want it or not.
Yes.
For, that's probably been going for several generations already. You don't have to be wealthy to have left a legacy, and feelings about money and what your family does.
100% correct. And that's where the conversations, you said it perfectly earlier, but for us, the conversations have to be relationship driven.
Mm-hmm.
Because in so many cases, many of these self-made people learn something about who they didn't want to be just as much about as who they wanted to be. And the things that they also learn from parents or whoever it happens to be, a particular mentor, were things that drove them to be who they are today. And they want to carry those things through, maybe much more differently than just the money.
Yeah, when you're talking to clients about this sort of stuff, I mean, often, clients will have sort of the instinct to try to like really do a lot, right? Especially, if they haven't maybe been the most present parent, because they've been busy building a business that is like really their favorite child. And this idea of leaving a legacy they can see as their sort of last bite at the apple is sort of like, okay, go big, really leave my imprint on this family beyond just, the breadwinner. But that's often like a pretty big mistake to try to like all of a sudden shoehorn too much. How do you talk to clients about that and sort of the idea that legacy is this very important thing, but also like, don't go crazy,
Yeah, I mean, it's anything else they've done in their life. They're not going all in on one thing or another, right? They don't have this kind of concentration of things in particular vehicles or things, just like they would do in investing or anything else. And that's why we often try to talk about where are you today versus where you think you may be. And if we can build in our thought process some flexibility about where you may be, that's going to be helpful to you, especially in our world. Obviously, if you're dealing with anything to do with insurance, it's really hard to fix the problem if you're 85.
Yeah.
Right. And so, this is where we want to build in places where we can figure out how and why they want to do specific things and how they specifically feel about anything or anyone that they feel a special sense of obligation to. And there may be obligation, and I use obligation because it may be, hey, my daughter's in the business, but my son's not. And I feel like I may need to do something differently. And getting them just to talk about those kind of dichotomies sometimes are really, really important about where they're going in the future.
Yeah, how they feel about what's fair and what that means to them.
Yes, very much. Very much.
Yeah, it's also, this. I think you brought up the idea of where they're going, because obviously if you're having a conversation with a 60-year-old and they have kids that are 30, in 20 years, when this plan is actually going to be enacted, hopefully, they're going to be 80 and those kids are going to be 50. That's very different situations. I mean, this is a plan they may have made. They may have still been doing triathlons at 60, and their kids were, just starting their careers. And now it's like, their kids may have grandkids.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, so much can change, in these period of years we're talking about, generally when people start doing this planning.
And that's why we talk about the flexibility, Dave, because one great story he had was a guy who was trying to put some things in how he wanted to distribute some of that through some of the trusts along the way. And I said, essentially what you're saying, which is, okay, when your kids are 50 and 55, what's going to happen? And he finally paused and he said, at that point, if my kids are idiots, I guess there's nothing I could do about it. That's literally what he said. And I said, well, there's kind of some truth in that. So you're going to have to figure that out a little bit. But that's also why what you said earlier about not having, kind of being absolute in your planning at this point really helps.
Yeah. It's also like getting across to parents that their kids aren't children. Like, they are their children, of course, but they are not necessarily children. You'll see, I've spoken to advisors who, their clients are so worried, so concerned about whether their eldest son is ready to take over the business. And it's like, my eldest kid, I don't know about him. And it's like, well, how old is he? It's like, oh, he's 67. He's been working in the business for 45 years. And it's like, okay, can we we're talking about like your kids. They realize sometimes your kids are 60 like with these clients.
Exactly. And the psychological part of it is so important because you try to get people to say, at some point you have to let go and there's going to be no choice at some point. And so how do you want that to go?
Mm-hmm.
And there's an infallibility part of it that some people feel. They really feel that they're in the Superman syndrome. And you have to navigate that a little bit, because some people get pretty indignant about the fact that you would say, at some point, this is going to end for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that cuts two ways too. I think it's easy to think that, what you're handing off is the end all be all because that's what it is to you.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that's what it is to them. It may be something they don't care about, or even if it is something they care deeply about, it may be much more of a burden for them than it is for you. Then you may be passing them off a burden instead of an opportunity.
Yes. And these conversations are not always easy. And so sometimes you have to sit and ask a question that is a little uncomfortable from the perspective of saying, have you had these conversations with your children or your family in any way, shape, or form? No, I haven't. And the hard question to ask, David, is, can you tell me why?
Mm-hmm.
And the most important thing at that point to do is to shut up, because you can learn a lot by just saying why they didn't have the conversation. And as we kind of started out earlier, said maybe they didn't have those conversations with their parents. Maybe they had the conversation with their parents and it went poorly.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they feel put upon about that. Maybe it happened somewhere else in the family with a brother or a sister or something like that. So the more we can learn about that, kind of those underlying thoughts and causes, the more we can hopefully get to the things that will ultimately help them and just make them a little more comfortable with a very uncomfortable subject.
Yeah. And also, the wording you used, we already had that conversation. It's like, it's not really a conversation that you just have once. It's like you're not checking it off the checklist. Like, you got to revisit and come back and be like, do we still all want this? Is this still a thing that seems good for everyone?
Yeah. And on top of that, that conversation normally, David, is a monologue.
Yeah.
You're being told what's going to happen and how it's going to happen, and not asked what you think or whether you like it.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're trying to find out ways and figure out ways we can help people maybe just have a little bit more openness about the things that really matter in life. And generally, it's not going to be about the money at the end of the day. It's certainly important to people, and certainly important, obviously, to preserve it if that's what people want to do. But ultimately, I think the other conversations create those things versus the other way around.
It's funny. One of my my very favorite movies that actually touches on legacy has nothing to do with estate planning whatsoever, really. It's a documentary called Jiro Dreams of Sushi. And I don't know if you've seen it, but it's about a very famous sushi chef in Japan who has a very famous restaurant with Michelin stars that's at a subway station. And he has two sons, and one of them is the heir apparent and has been for 30 years. And Jiro is ancient at this point, and the second son is sort of just like an afterthought. And that, you would think that, like, oh, well, the one is being handed everything and the other is being left out in the cold. But as it turns out, and maybe this is sort of a more uniquely Japanese thing, but is that the younger child had the freedom to open his own restaurant and succeed wildly in his own way out of the shadow of his father. And the older son, the heir apparent, who was being handed the keys, to the car, so to speak, is just still sitting there waiting. And he's been sort of just like beaten down and miserable
Yeah.
by the whole thing. And you would think like that's the guy who's getting the handout, but like it didn't really turn out that way.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because one of the legends in our business, a gentleman named Sid Freeman, once said multiple times said to audiences, said, I don't want you to be the second best me. I want you to be the best version of you.
Yeah.
And so many times in estate planning, it's not about being the person that created this, that's the person you want to be, because success means different things to different people. And I think in so many cases, these familial conversations often need to go around, who is it that you want to be, as much as what do you want to be? And I don't think those conversations happen all the time. And we do our best to try to, bring those out if we can.
Mm-hmm. And also, there's a benefit to the advisors too, right? Other than serving your clients, is that this is a pretty easy way to connect with the next generation that, as statistics would show, tends not to stick around with the advisor once the previous generation goes. These sort of conversations and incorporating them and making sure, as you said, that they're two-way conversations and not monologues is both just good business and good for the client, and it's good for the advisor because it's the backdoor way to sort of make contact with and create relationships with the second and third generation that, normally, you'd fall into that, where you might just be like the guy in the suit who shows up at mom and dad's funeral, and that's the first time they're meeting you. And that's sort of the nightmare scenario for an advisor.
100% correct. And this for me is one of our focuses that we've tried to do is we have so many multi-generational families with what we've done. And that was a conscious effort. Mm-hmm. And that to me is humbling. And also what we hope is our legacy is that we made this multi-generational and that you build that kind of level of trust and belief, and people know that you're looking out for them because the relationship was the driver of everything that we did.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the expectations are changing, right? It used to be, I mean, some advisors still do it. Like even talking to the spouse, be it male or female, was sort of like, oh yeah, no, you're not the one with the money. I don't care what you think.
Yeah.
But they're going to be the one with the money. It's going to happen, very likely. And then now, it's the same idea, except you have this whole wider spread of generations that it's like, if I really, if this, how much money this is, if I really want to keep these clients, I've got to start, really getting into this spider web of relationships that they have, because these people need to at least know my name.
Yes. And especially the younger generation, David, because they are dealing with so much more information. They have so many things at their fingertips that their parents did not. And I'm not saying that in a good way, because as I've tried to say to people all the time, on the internet, there's a gazillion bytes of information, but there's not a whole lot of bytes of knowledge. And if we can impart some of that to them, if we can do anything along those lines, people, I think, are thirsty for that as opposed to just something that they're pulling up, what I tend to call Dr. Google.
You really get yourself in trouble just sticking on those symptoms, right? And freaking yourself directly out.
Right. Yeah. That's if you start watching that stuff, you're going to take medication you didn't need just because you're so anxious at that point.
So earlier you mentioned people becoming more philanthropic
Yes.
as they get to this stage. Can we just talk about philanthropy in general and sort of what role it plays and what role it can play in sort of this legacy planning process?
Yeah, great question. Again, one of the questions that we ask is philanthropy a priority for you? And you will be amazed at the variety of answers that you get, because then you can ask, is there anything or anyone specifically like that? And how about this question, because we ask this all the time, is would you like your heirs to be an ongoing part of that process?
Mm-hmm.
Now you're opening up this whole other thought process. And now it gives you also an opportunity to possibly involve other people in what you're trying to do for them to create the legacy as a family that they may not have created without those questions.
Mm-hmm. And there's so many sort of tendrils of these sort of questions, that philanthropy can reach into, right? Where it's just sort of like, what are our family values just as people? But also it's like, how do we train the next generation to sort of handle money? Well, philanthropy is a good way, even if they mess it up, what do they mess up giving it away? At least it's going somewhere to a cause. Like the fail state of screwed up philanthropy is like, okay, it's not that bad. So it can be a great tool for sort of introducing the next generation to sort of their responsibilities of wealth.
Right. And remember too, that people often have gotten into philanthropy because it's what they were told to do.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're seeing, I think, a little more of lately is people being more targeted with that philanthropy. And I think that's the stuff they can pass on as legacy even better if it's just not just this general thought was we're supposed to give away money.
Mm-hmm. But there's also like with anything, there's a bit of a flip side to that, right? Where you don't want to be too specific because then you're just creating another sort of golden set of handcuffs, right? Where, if you've successfully raised philanthropic children, but they happen to not be philanthropic about the exact, maybe someone is really just, here's an example. They love the state of Israel is their number one philanthropic interest, and their kids have grown up in a different generation and they don't have, perhaps the same fondness for it, but they care about world hunger or AIDS research or something else. To put them in charge of your foundation for the state of Israel, that's maybe not something that is going to help them. That's a burden.
Yes.
For something, for even though they're a very philanthropic person, you've now given them something they don't care about.
And it's the same thought process with the business,
mm-hmm.
because that has maybe a little bit more visceral reaction because of whatever that particular charitable endeavor happens to be. But it's interesting you mentioned foundations, because a lot of times when the foundations are created, the children become the people that are dispensing the money.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you learn a lot along those lines as well, because you find out if you're doing that, where your kids kind of thought process lies, and what that means to them and how you want to do that, because you can create it in different ways. So I think your point is very, very well taken, that they may go a different direction. And that's same thing philanthropically. The flexibility thought process is always something that we have in mind.
Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, I mean, we're really just, again, saying flexibility and communication are key, and, not to be too married to the exactitudes of what the legacy is, and more just, that the legacy is in the general direction that you're happy
You
with.
hit the nail on the head, because the communication is everything. And most times the failures come from the lack of communication. And most times you see these things, a lot of times it's not what they've actually done, it's how they've communicated what they've done that caused the biggest problems.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of fights. I think listeners would be shocked by how many estate planning fights are just more about people's initial visceral reaction to finding something out that maybe if they had found it out 20 years ago when mom and dad were there in person to explain to them the thought process, they would just have not cared.
Exactly right. And it can also create these fissures that happen between siblings that could easily have been mitigated, maybe not completely, but to some extent mitigated, and just having talked them out a little bit while everybody's still around.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is important, I guess, to highlight, like you said, that you can't mitigate everything. Like some fights are just going to happen because there's just too much history. There's too many things that went down before you were even involved to really, and you're not a god who can prevent these things. Sort of the advisor's job is to try to make those fights as sort of less intense and as brief as they can possibly be. Yes. But you can't head off everything. Just because there is a fight doesn't mean that the plan failed.
And today's world, David, with second marriages and stepchildren and all this other stuff, I mean, the complications they get crazy. And that's where you really need a good team approach of people that can help with those things. And I always felt that if everybody collaborated on behalf of the client, then everybody won.
Yeah, we got to break down the silos that, it doesn't work anymore.
Exactly.
So, I think we're sort of coming to the end of things here. I'd like to thank Ian Freeman for being a great guest and for sort of helping us unpack a pretty nebulous topic, something that's really hard to fit into a 30-minute conversation. So thanks so much for joining us, Ian.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And the memoir is called Life Beneath the Suit: Madness, Mayhem, and the Meaning I Found in the Mess. Do we have any idea when people can start looking for that on the shelves?
I hope it will be out within the next 60 days, and hope it's not long. It's an easy read, and hopefully I won't bore anybody. So thank you.
Well, you certainly haven't bored anybody today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure's mine. Thanks again.
And for all our listeners, I'll see you, or I guess you'll hear me, on the next episode of Celebrity Estates: Wills of the Rich and Famous. Every estate tells a story. Some define a legacy, while others highlight lessons learned the hard way. To avoid costly planning pitfall, trust companies, banks, and wealth management firms rely on the full suite of modern solutions from SS&C Black Diamond Trust Services. Whether optimizing for tax efficiency, managing complex assets, or securing intergenerational wealth, Black Diamond helps you bring clarity and control to the most complicated estates. Learn more at www.sscblackdiamond.com. SS&C Black Diamond, powering the future of trust and estate management.
Thank you for listening to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. Click the subscribe button below to become notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of InformaWealthManagement.com. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.